Hello, my name is Valerie Gello and I'm a licensed mental health counselor here at First Light Psychological Services. In this webinar, I will be discussing effective communication skills that can be applied to any and all interactions with others. Communication is an essential part of your life from birth until death. Without it, you would feel eternal confusion and frustration. There would be no way for you to understand the world or for the world to understand you. You might be thinking, well, people would just be primitive and can make sounds and gestures instead. Kind of like what I'm doing now. But that's a form of communication too. It's just considered nonverbal. So without communication, your brain would be so underdeveloped and nothing would ever be done efficiently, if at all. That is how powerful and important communication is. Everything we have in our world today is a product of it. Communication can lead to advancements. So by improving your own communication skills, you can advance your own life to make it less stressful and more meaningful. An individual's behavioral style greatly affects their ability to communicate. People don't typically use one style. It changes depending on the situation and the audience. Being able to identify one's own behavioral style requires a high level of self-awareness, and when you achieve that, you can better communicate and better understand, which leads to getting along better with others as a whole. Throughout this video, see if there are different aspects of communication that you can identify with, and then think about when you do this and with whom. My goal is to help you reflect so that you can address any areas in need of improvement for overall communication rejuvenation. There are multiple forms of communication, but the simplest way to break them down is really into two categories: verbal and nonverbal. Verbal is defined as relating to words, so this is where language comes in. Verbal communication can be both spoken and written, so things like talking, texting, emailing, etc. Nonverbal would be without relating to words, like images, sounds, gestures, body language, and more. Now, this might get a little confusing, but communication gets broken down even further into what is audible and inaudible. So for example, if you were to take verbal, audible communication, that would be like what I'm doing now, talking. I'm speaking with words and you can hear me. It's audible. Nonverbal, audible communication would be what is known as paralinguistics, which is important to help emphasize emotions. And that's just one piece of it. Paralinguistics is going to include pitch and tone of voice. But if you really think about it, other forms of audible, nonverbal communication is also going to be things like music, instrumentals. You're conveying things, you're conveying a message, emotions, whatever the case is. And it's something you can hear, but it does not involve words. So now take the inverse. If you have something that's inaudible, something inaudible but verbal would be things like writing, texting, and emailing. The reason so is because, again, verbal includes words. So you can't hear it, but you can still read it. So now, on the other hand, if you have inaudible, nonverbal communication, that's going to be things like body language, gestures, eye contact, pictures, photographs, videos, anything that you can't hear, but you can see it and you don't use words for it. So again, I know this is a little bit confusing, but I'm going to clarify it up ahead, so just bear with me. But I do want to mention one thing now with regard to writing, texting, and emailing, all that stuff, because we live in a world with technology. So we rely on computers and phones and tablets and all that stuff for a lot of our communication. Digital communication has become a preferred method of contact for many, and it allows for us to connect with people all over the world, which can have amazing benefits. Texting and instant messaging in particular is convenient, but it does have the potential to produce a lot of communication barriers. As we all know, you cannot hear one's tone of voice and see their demeanor. So now I'm going to go into the different communication styles, and then I'll give you a little bit more insight about how they might look, both audible and inaudible, and verbal and nonverbal. So the first one is passive communication. So this is a style in which individuals have developed this pattern of avoiding expressing their opinions, their feelings, their emotions, all of it, in effort to protect their rights and identifying and meeting their needs. As a result, passive individuals do not respond to anything hurtful or any anger-inducing situations. Instead, they're going to allow these things to build, and more times than not, especially in the beginning, they're unaware of the buildup. But once they have reached their high tolerance threshold for any unacceptable behavior, they're very prone to explosive outbursts, and they're typically going to be out of proportion to whatever the situation is that triggers it. After the outburst, they're going to feel symptoms of, I would say, maybe shame, guilt, even confusion. And that puts the person back into the cycle of being passive because now they just want to withdraw. So passive communicators often fail to assert themselves. They're going to allow people to walk all over them, infringing upon their rights, whether it's deliberate or not. They're often failing to express their feelings, needs, and opinions. And I would say they tend to speak softly, apologetically, poor eye contact, poor body posture, all of that. So the impact of a pattern of passive communication is that they're often anxious because life feels like it's out of their control. They're focusing so much on complying with others and they're too afraid to speak up that they're going along with literally everything else but their own desires, needs, and wants. So they're going to feel stuck, maybe even helpless. And over time, it leads to feelings of resentment. Again, they might be unaware of this at first, but it does build. And because their needs are not being met, they're going to feel confused and they might ignore their feelings. As a result, they're not really able to mature because the real issues, the root problems, are not being addressed. So now if I go back to all that confusion I said before, if you start with verbal communication, so again, using your words, something that's going to be both audible and inaudible with words is speaking and writing. So whether a passive person is speaking these things, again, audible, or writing these things, inaudible, this is how it might present. They might say things like, well, let's do it your way. Doesn't really matter to me. Whatever works for you. They might think, I'm unable to stand up for myself and my rights. I don't even know what my rights are. And even when I do, I get stepped on by everyone. They might feel like I'm weak and I'm unable to take care of myself. And people don't consider my thoughts and feelings anyway, so what does it matter? Now, switch to what's nonverbal. The audible, nonverbal things that you might hear is somebody speaking in a very soft, meek voice or speaking very hesitantly. Very, very passive, very passive. You have to think about it like that. Very quiet. Now, inaudible, nonverbal communication would take the form of poor eye contact. Somebody would be looking away, and that would really indicate anxiety. Maybe they're fidgeting, they might be hunched over, trying to appear small. Again, thinking of meek and timid. They don't want to cause a problem, they just want to comply. Very submissive. You might also see somebody crossing their arms. This is usually to kind of gain a sense of security when they're feeling insecure. Another thing you might see is also their shoulders up, very tense, or generally appearing withdrawn. Again, very, very submissive. Another thing you might see is somebody tapping their feet, shuffling nervously, or their legs very crossly. Oh my goodness, I can't communicate now. Their legs are going to be crossed tightly. So again, very anxious, very withdrawn, very timid, very submissive. So that's passive communication. So now there are instances, actually numerous instances really, where passive communication is necessary. A few situations like this might include when something is minor, where you hear the saying, pick your battles, is it really worth it, because sometimes the problems caused by the potential conflict end up being worse than the actual conflict. So another example I would say, when emotions are running high. Sometimes it's easier to be passive, and it's a good thing because it allows people to kind of just calm down and take a step back. It doesn't mean that you can't revisit this later. It just might be the best thing to do in the moment, really de-escalating the situation. So the next style is passive aggressive communication. So this is going to be a style where on the surface, the person appears passive, like what I just talked about. But really what they're doing is acting out their anger in a very subtle, indirect, or kind of behind the scenes way. People that develop a pattern of passive aggressive communication usually feel powerless, stuck, and resentful. So they feel incapable of dealing directly with the object or person of their resentments. So again, think of that passive person. The longer something like that goes on, the more the resentment builds. So now when the resentment builds, before they get to the point of acting out, it might come out in the form of passive aggression. So they might be expressing their anger by subtly undermining the object. So sometimes this is real or imagined. But again, the focus is going to be from their resentments. So what you're going to see with this is people muttering to themselves as opposed to confronting the person or the issue. They're going to have a hard time acknowledging their anger. You're going to see a lot of facial expressions that don't match how the person feels, such as smiling when angry. And there's a lot of sarcasm that's involved with passive aggressive communication, even denying that there's a problem at all. They might appear cooperative, but they're purposely doing things to be disruptive or annoying in some way. And that's to very, very subtly sabotage or, what's a good word for this? Maybe even get revenge in a way. Trying to get justice, but again, very mild way of doing it, very subtle. So now, the impact of a pattern of passive aggressive communication is that these individuals become alienated from those around them because they get stuck in a position of powerlessness, and all they do is discharge this resentment all the time while real issues are never addressed. So they can't fully mature. And this is why people are not going to want to be around them, because after a while, it gets old. Again, this is not a healthy way to communicate. It happens, it's normal, but it's still something to be mindful of. So verbal communication, that's passive aggressive, that's also audible and inaudible. Again, speaking and writing, you're going to see a lot of sarcasm, a lot of complaining. Maybe things like, yeah, okay, yep, all right, I'm fine, a lot of sarcasm. And they might say things to themselves or others, mostly to themselves if you're thinking their thoughts, their really deep internal thoughts, is that I'm weak and I'm resentful. So I'm just going to sabotage and frustrate everybody else. That's going to give me that sense of revenge because I can't just speak up about my problem. I can't go directly and address the problem. So I'm going to lash out in all these different ways. The person is powerless. So they might appear cooperative again, but they're not. So now if you think of nonverbal passive aggressive communication, that's audible. You're going to hear a lot of disgusted sounds like ugh, muttering and things like that. You ever hear somebody, freaking person, I can't stand this person. A lot of muttering, but it's anger at the core of that, a lot of anger. So you might not even hear what this person's saying. So it's audible, but it almost borders inaudible because you can't really make sense of what they're actually saying. So coupled with these emotions of disgust, you're going to see the inaudible nonverbal communication of rolling your eyes. Ugh, oh my God, things like that. Nope, don't want to deal with this. Things like that, all right? Or silence. Sometimes they don't say anything at all. It's just, ugh. See, a lot of disgust. So, and a lot of looking away, facing away. The goal is to ignore. They don't want to hear the other person. They're not being heard. They don't feel like their needs are being met. So why should they listen to anybody else? Another thing you might see is their legs crossed, generally appearing as if they don't care, and arms crossed. Again, so somebody passive aggressive is just A lot of attitude. So now the third style is aggressive communication. So this is a style where people are expressing their feelings and opinions, and they are advocating for their needs, not like the passive aggressive communicator or the passive communicator, but they're doing it in a way that violates the rights of others. Thus, aggressive communicators are verbally and or physically abusive. They're often trying to dominate others. They might be condescending, using humiliation, trying to control others, criticizing, blaming, verbal attacks. They can also be very impulsive with this stuff because they have a very low frustration tolerance. Also, they might have a louder tone of voice, very demanding, very overbearing. And it can sometimes come off as not just rude, but really threatening. And they don't listen well as a result. They're interrupting frequently, a lot of use statements, very intimidating. The whole point is so that they can gain and maintain control of whoever it is that they're speaking to. So now, same thing as passive aggressive communicators, the impact is about the same. You're going to see them get alienated from others because nobody wants to be subjected to that. And they're going to generate a lot of fear and hatred in others. And if they always blame others instead of owning their own issues, they're not going to be able to mature and they're just pushing other people away. So more specific ways that this might present, I'm going to keep repeating it, the verbal, both audible and inaudible, speaking and writing, is going to look, I would say, as far as like the internal thoughts go, it's going to be things like, I'm superior, I'm right, you're inferior and you're wrong. I'm loud, I'm bossy, I'm pushy, I can dominate and intimidate you. I can violate your rights. I'll get my way no matter what. You're not worth anything. It's all your fault. I react instantly. I'm entitled, you owe me, and I own you. See, things like that. So now if you notice, and I'm trying not to get too overbearing on the camera, but if your nonverbal communication that's aggressive is audible, it's going to be loud. It's going to be yelling. It's going to be a lot of fast speech. The person inaudibly and non-verbally, they might look like they're frowning or their brows are furrowed or maybe they're glaring at you. Very rigid posture, standing tall, puffing out their chest, trying to appear bigger. Unlike the passive communicator, again, who tries to look small and meek, the aggressive person is going to be looming over the other person that they're talking to. A lot of intense eye contact, just staring, trying to maintain that control. But again, it's going to be very, very loud and overbearing. You're wrong. I'm right. My needs are more important than you. So you need to listen to me because this is my way. You don't matter. A lot of that. Again, you're going to see a lot of cursing with this too. You do see that with all of them because, again, even if you have a passive aggressive communicator, maybe they're cursing under their breath or in their mind, but somebody who's aggressive, they might use a lot of verbal threats and, like vulgar language. So I would think it's obvious more times than not, aggressive communication is really not the way to go. But there are times where people use it and it's somewhat appropriate. The biggest situation like this really would be emergencies. Sometimes when decisions have to be made quickly and people are under pressure and they're in the heat of the moment, they might quick make demands. Hurry, you go do this. I'm doing that. Go take care of this. And maybe the intention is not to be overpowering. It's just to hurry up and get something done. Because again, aggressive communicators are being impulsive. They're not really thinking. They're just really acting upon the emotions that they're feeling. So now the last one is the healthy one, assertive communication. So assertive and aggressive communication can get mixed up because both of them involve where people are stating their opinions and feelings and they are being firm in advocating for their rights and needs. But the difference is, the key difference between the two is that the assertive communicator is not violating the rights of others, whereas the aggressive communicator is violating the rights of others. They're dismissive of them and they don't want to hear it. Whereas the assertive person, they value themselves, their time, their emotional, spiritual, and physical needs. They're very strong advocates for themselves, but they are very respectful of the rights of others. So what they're going to be doing is they're very clear, very appropriate, and very respectful. And they use a lot of I statements, not a lot of you, or me. It's I feel, not you made me feel this way. Now you're going to pay, like the aggressive communicator. This is just, I feel this way. They're looking for resolve. They're just trying to explain what's going on with them. And they do communicate respect for others because an assertive person is going to listen without interrupting. And the biggest thing is also that they feel in control of themselves. They're not trying to control others. They're in control of their own emotions, and they're just trying to communicate it in an effective way so that they can get resolve in a way that works best for both parties or multiple parties, whoever, again, is involved. Whereas, again, aggressive person is all out for themselves. So another thing is much better eye contact with a person who's assertive, much clearer, calmer tone of voice, relaxed body posture, more inviting and feeling connected to other people. And they're generally just confident. They're confident. And they're not allowing other people to abuse or manipulate them. They're not going to tolerate that because, again, they're standing up for their rights. So the impact long-term of a person who has a pattern of assertive communication is that, again, they feel more connected to other people. They feel more control of their lives, and they're able to mature properly because they are addressing the issues and problems as they arise in the moment. They create a very respectful environment for others to grow and mature. So, verbal, here we go again, audible and inaudible, speaking and writing. You're going to see an assertive communicator saying or believing or behaving in ways that come off as, I hear you and I understand. Maybe, can you clarify this further? Because I don't understand. I want to understand and I'm confused. And as a result, I feel this way. You see what I mean? Like I'm referencing myself in this, but I'm also referencing the other person. I'm being considerate of both. I have to take care of myself and my own needs, but I do need to acknowledge that somebody else is involved here. It's not just about me. So again, you might see statements like, we are equally entitled to express ourselves and we can still be respectful of one another. I'm confident about who I am and I realize I have choices in my life and I'm just considering my options. Again, not controlling others, just controlling myself. And placing a very high priority on having not only my rights respected, but making sure that the other person feels respected too. So as you can see, that's my key word here. It's respect, respect, respect. But the person is being responsible in getting their needs met in this manner. So they also might feel that maybe inside, maybe they feel that somebody owes them something, but they're not going to come out and say it this way. They're going to be thinking in a calmer state of mind, a little more clear-headed. Nobody owes me anything unless they've agreed to give it to me. That's how you really have to think about it. That's how an assertive person is. They're 100%, 100%. Oh my goodness. I can't communicate now. They're 100% responsible for their own happiness. So now somebody that's doing nonverbal, assertive communication, that's audible, you're going to hear a lot of and they're listening and they're maybe making a small sound just to convey that, yes, they are listening, not just, stare with nothing, silence, because you want them to know you're listening. And the inaudible nonverbal thing, the body language and different things you're going to see is, maintaining strong but appropriate eye contact. It's not that death glare that the aggressive person is going to give. It's natural, and they might break it off every so often because that's natural. But it's going to be a softer gaze. Maybe they're sitting up straight, but they're relaxed and confident. They're facing the person. They're not facing away, they're facing them. They're trying to give the person their full attention. And they might even be mirroring the other person's body language. Another thing you'll see coupled with those audible nonverbal sounds is nodding. Like you're following along with what the other person is saying. And the facial expressions that you might see are more neutral, more so in concern of the other person, not this, furrowed brows and looking angry. Because again, that's too aggressive. There is a balance. So now, if you're in a situation where someone tells you a joke and it evokes the emotion of happiness, an audible, verbal communication would be to say, that joke was funny. You can hear me, and I'm speaking it. And the audible, again, the thing that you can hear, nonverbal thing would be laughing, right? You're laughing at the joke, and you think, yeah, that joke's funny. So now an inaudible verbal communication, using the same example, would be, all right, now I'm going to write this joke down on a piece of paper because, maybe you want to remember it for later and share it with somebody else. Maybe you write it in a note on your phone, wherever. You're writing it down. So you can't hear it, but you're using words. And then an inaudible, something you can't hear, and it's nonverbal, not using words, would be things like the gestures and expression you make after you hear this joke, like smiling. So now, think about when somebody tells you something that makes you angry. Audibly and verbally, you may, maybe you curse at whatever or whoever it is that evoked this anger. Audibly and non-verbally, you might let out a loud cry, like, ah! See, it's audible, you can hear it, but there's no words, it's just a sound. And then inaudibly and verbally, maybe now you send a text message to your friend and you tell them about how you're feeling in this moment since you need to vent to somebody. And then inaudibly and non-verbally, you're clenching your fists and you're furrowing your brows because you're so mad. So this is how communication is broken down. So these are just some examples so you can see how there can be multiple things going on simultaneously when you're communicating. So that's why, again, it's really, really important that you're aware and mindful of all aspects because it's going to assist in greater effectiveness of whatever it is that you're trying to convey. So now, second part of this is the importance of knowing your audience. It's frustrating. I know it's frustrating. There's some people that you just can't seem to get through to them no matter how hard you try. And the thing about this is that as frustrating as it is, you have to work with your audience instead of against them. As frustrating as it is, if you know that somebody in your life acts a certain way, especially when they're feeling a certain emotion, work with it. You have to go with the flow because the more resistant you are to them, the more resistant they're going to be to you because they're going to feel like you don't understand them. So the best way to receive and process accurate information is called active listening. So let's say you have a busy day and you ask your significant other to run some errands on your behalf, such as going to the grocery store, because you have to work late, let's just say. So later when you get home, you notice that there are no groceries to be found. So you go up to your significant other and you ask very assertively, hey, did you get the groceries? And they respond, no. But before they even finish your sentence, you immediately feel anger building because all you heard was no. So you may feel the need to defend yourself or state how they were wrong and you're right. Maybe you lash out at them and it turns into an argument. Had active listening been used, you would have learned that the reason maybe your significant other didn't get the groceries is because they ended up having to work late as well. And they had only just gotten home right before you did. Therefore, there was no need to prove a point or become defensive. And the argument may have been completely avoided if you think about it, because if you heard the whole sentence, you would have understood and realized, oh, okay, this was not in this person's control, and it's not, some kind of personal attack or them being dismissive in some way. That being said, it is normal to immediately begin to formulate a response in your mind based on the information you receive. But it is important to refrain from focusing on your own thoughts and response formulation until the person has completely finished speaking and making their point. Because again, otherwise you might lose out on the whole point, really. You could really miss it, because if you're only hearing that first bit, how do you know what the person's even going to say? I'm sure you've maybe been in a situation like that before too, where somebody interrupts you and you're like, no, that's not what I was going to say. You didn't let me finish. Just let me finish. So that's really important. You have to let the other person finish and then remind them to allow you to also finish your point as well. And just focusing your complete attention on that person, hearing everything they say, and now you come up with your response. So some tips on being an active listener include listening without making judgments or making any final decisions, because again, you'll lack the understanding of the other person's perspective unless you give them your full attention. So again, this means not interrupting when the other person speaks. And this also includes not speaking immediately after someone else finishes talking, because if you think about it, sometimes people need a moment to finish formulating their thoughts. People take, different times and different amounts of time, I guess you could say, to process things. Sometimes you need a second to just kind of catch up with what the person said. You ever see someone kind of looking around and they're just, they're following along, but they need a second. Just give people a second, because not everybody is going to process at the same speed. They have to make sense of it, especially if you're saying a lot of things at one time. So that being said, after you allow people to finish formulating their thoughts, it might even be helpful for you to ask, again, in a respectful, calm, neutral tone, if the person would like to add anything further before you respond. Could be helpful. Might help clarify things. Another thing is reflective listening. This is another very healthy way to effectively communicate. What it is it involves repeating back what you have just listened to the best of your ability to ensure that you have perceived and understood the information correctly. By doing this, you avoid the risk of oh my goodness, I'm struggling here with my communication. I guess it's been a long Monday. But yes, so again, you avoid the risk of a miscommunication occurring because you're repeating back the person's information. So that way, if you repeat something back and then they say to you, well, no, that's not what I meant. Now there's an opportunity there to at least clarify, as opposed to jumping ahead, saying your point, them feeling like, no, that's not what I was saying. Why are you saying I said that? And then again, turning into a whole heated mess. So another thing is asking, again, follow-up questions from the listener in response. And this can continue until the message has been made completely clear. If you need to ask a bunch of questions, better to do that than to make assumptions. So again, you might not always be successful, especially right away after making changes, but that's part of life and part of adjusting. These things don't happen overnight. And as I said before, even if you're being assertive and you have good intentions, they can be lost. Because again, think about what I said before, where the person says no, and then they get cut off. Maybe the person's trying to say something and maybe they're trying to speak back, but if they're cut off, it gets lost. And another example actually that I hear about a lot is if somebody, maybe a parent or a child, anybody in your life, a significant other, if they're really perseverating on something and they're repeating themselves, you can say something assertive like, I know you're just being thorough because you are concerned, and I appreciate that, which is why I want to reassure you that you don't need to worry about reiterating yourself. Instead of saying something like, you're repeating yourself, because what if it gets cut off right there? All the person hears is, you're repeating yourself. And that can be perceived as maybe an aggressive statement, when in actuality, the other oh my goodness, I should make a blooper reel. I think I'm going to. But yeah, so instead of you repeating yourself, I know you're just trying to help, and I do appreciate that. What if that's the sentence? Again, if you cut off that sentence, all you heard was you're repeating yourself. Someone's not going to be happy if they hear that, especially if they are just trying to help you. And they might feel invalidated in that moment. So again, very important to validate. That's your assertive communication. So let's say that did happen, right? And you say, you're repeating yourself, and the other person cuts you off, and they say, stop telling me that I'm repeating myself. I'm making sure that you do okay, etc., etc., etc. Now the person can start to get aggressive. So again, you started off as assertive, but now they perceived it in a different way, and now they're coming at you aggressively. And if you know how you respond in situations like that, let's say you get triggered when somebody yells, you might instantly go into, defensive mode, and now maybe you become passive. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. I'm sorry. Or, ugh, you know what? Whatever. You always do this. Passive aggressive, right? Or even just aggressive. What if you start yelling back at the other person and now you're just going back and forth? It turns into a whole mess. So you have to be very, very careful. And it's better to just slow down, because otherwise people are just going to end up feeling dismissed, unappreciated, and everything in between, instead of being validated for coming from a place of concern, compassion, and respect. Because again, even if their delivery isn't on point, like abrasive parents who mean well, but maybe it's just their culture or their personality. You have to really think about who the person is and where are they coming from. Everybody's different. So, that being said, a few more things as far as barriers. You want to be careful about some things like physical barriers, like your equipment. What if you're on the phone and there's background noise? Or if you're thinking about images, for example, if there's poor lighting on an image, stuff like that, that can actually impact the message that's trying to be communicated. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. Your attitude, because attitude is what helps to enhance your emotions, right? The way you emphasize things. So emotions like anger or sadness can actually impact that in a harmful way, or maybe being extremely nervous, having a personal agenda, or needing to be right no matter what. These kind of things can make communications less effective. And it's also known as what's called as emotional noise. It's just adding to the mess. You don't want to make things worse, especially if you're trying to find, some kind of resolution to a problem. Don't want to make it worse. Language. It's another big one, language. Seems like it would be a simple thing, but think about people that have language barriers or difficulty understanding each other if you're from different generations, different regions, all those things, because people use a lot of slang, a lot of jargon, and that can hurt communicators even with the best intentions. Another physiological barrier would be things like poor eyesight or hearing difficulties, because again, poor eyesight, you're going to have trouble seeing things like somebody's body language or maintaining eye contact, facial expressions. And if you have issues hearing things, well, it's going to impact all that audible communication, all the sounds you make, all the words you speak. So that's another key thing. Another thing I would suggest you guys keep in mind too is communicating within a workplace. There's always a lot of disconnect with bosses and employees or even just coworkers. You have to be careful about any kind of faulty communication in a workplace or some type of lack of supervision, even with a training. Because again, if you're trying to train somebody to do something or convey some message for somebody to go do some type of task, you have to communicate in an effective way. whether it's electronically, email, that's a big thing with work, texting, all that stuff has to be considered. Cultural noise, another one. Now, I know I referenced it earlier. People make a lot of stereotypical assumptions about others based on cultural backgrounds. So keep that in mind as well. You want to be careful about being quick to judge. Another thing is experience, actually. A lack of experience can be a barrier because let's say you're trying to use an example of, some kind of story. You're using a story to explain your point, and you figure, all right, if I, demonstrate this whole thing and I tell this story, the person will understand me better. But what if the audience cannot relate to what the speaker is saying? What if they didn't have the same experiences or they don't feel the same way about these experiences? Well, then this tool is just ineffective. So another reason why it's important to know your audience. Another thing is also things being half said. Maybe too many generalizations, a lot of thinking errors. It can lead to misinterpretations. So be careful of that too. You have to be careful about anything that seems ambiguous or abstract. You don't want to overuse that kind of stuff. You can lose the point. And another thing, this happens a lot, information overload. It takes time, like I said before, to process a lot of information. So too many details at one time can really overwhelm and even distract a person from the important topics and whatever the point is. So sometimes it's better to keep it short and sweet. So think about your audience. If they need things to be more simple, do it that way. Just be simple, like a child. You're not going to have this complex explanation or story or something for a child if they have a limited ability to understand it and relate to it. So kind of tying it in with some of the ones I mentioned earlier. So know your audience. It involves age, your gender, your culture, all of it. Everybody's different, personalities, all of it. And last but not least, as far as barriers, is making assumptions and jumping to conclusions. This is another thinking error, as we call it. Again, this goes back to cutting somebody off and interrupting them. You're reaching a conclusion before the person has even finished saying all of the facts. You haven't listened to them. So you have to be careful about that. Allow the person to finish first. All right, so a couple more things before we wrap up for you guys. So some tips for you guys. These are really helpful, actually. It's okay to take a break. If you feel like you're reaching a point in this communication where there's a conflict going on, things are getting more heated, things are getting more aggressive maybe, or maybe you're feeling, more passive and you're just, I can't handle this right now. You want to hide, you feel very withdrawn, or maybe you feel that attitude picking up a little bit and you're just, no, I don't want to hear you. Then it's okay to take a break. Because you can just say to the other person, listen, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I think it would be helpful if I take a break right now, just so I can process these things and we'll revisit this in, 10 minutes or in an hour, however long you need. Just as long as you communicate that need and you communicate it assertively and in a way that's not being dismissive of the other person, not something like, I can't deal with this right now. I can't. Just I'll be back, or even just storming off and going into the other room. Because again, passive aggressive, be very careful. So something that I have found to be helpful and a lot of my clients have found to be helpful is utilizing what's known as communication cards. Think of it as like an instruction manual for yourself. When you have an emotion, how do I present? What does that look like? Again, think about your verbal and nonverbal, your audible and inaudible communication. What does that look like when you're feeling a certain emotion? And now, what to do when this person's feeling the emotion and what not to do. You want to include that. So let's say you have a communication card and it says angry when you're feeling angry. You can't bring yourself to speak this. You're going to lash out. You note on this card, you might see me stomping around and lashing out. What not to do? Don't ask, what the hell is your problem? Or here we go again. Don't do things like that. And definitely don't avoid. Be assertive. Maybe something like, hey, are you okay? What do you need? I'm here. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes people don't need anything. They just need you to be there, knowing that you're there. Maybe they don't need anything in the moment, but just knowing that you're there for them and that you're willing to listen. Sometimes that's enough. So again, maybe when this person is presenting this way, what they do need is simply a hug. Let's say another communication card is anxiety. I'm feeling anxious. I might come off as irritable, that low frustration tolerance, but I really just need some help. Don't do these things. Do these things. You have to make it very clear. So again, think of it as if it's an instruction manual. And you can make a whole bunch of them. You can color code them. You can make it really fun. And it's helpful because when you're in the moment, and again, you feel like you're too emotionally charged to really say what you want to say, even if you have good intentions, show your communication card so that the other person understands, oh, this person, the person I'm talking to right now is sad, even though they're presenting in an angry way. Maybe they're just sad. Maybe they're hurt. And it says on this card, don't do this, but do this. You're going to help people figure out how to approach you in an effective way, how they can be helpful, and vice versa. So it's definitely a helpful tool. And for those that do utilize a lot of electronic communication, you can even use emojis. You can get really creative with this. I've seen people color code, red is for anger, blue is for sadness, and they might send like a little blue emoji, maybe the blue heart or a blue dot, whatever, you can get really creative. So it's kind of fun. So if you're out, you can just send that emoji and the person knows, oh, okay, they're experiencing this right now. And now I know what to do and what not to do. So I want to thank you again for joining me for Communication Rejuvenation. I hope that you have found this to be informative and helpful. Also, feel free to stay online if you have any brief questions that you'd like to ask me. I'd be happy to answer them. And be sure to check out our other videos. We have a lot of webinars available at this time, and you can find them at www.firstlightpsych.com.